Denver and Rio Grande Western number 340 is a C-19 class 280 consolidation locomotive. In the Denver and Rio Grande Western system of classing locomotives, it is a consolidation type, or 280, with 19,000 pounds of tractive effort. After a period of financial difficulty and reorganization, the 3-foot narrow gauge Denver and Rio Grande Railway reorganized into two independent systems on July 14, 1886. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad operated the lines in Colorado, and the Rio Grande Western operated the lines in Utah. Following the delivery of its Class 56 and Class 60, later C-16 280s, the D&RG decided they needed more powerful steam locomotives for the stiff 4% grades over Marshall Pass, Cerro Summit, and the newly completed Cumbres Pass segment of the San Juan extension, a main line that stretched from Alamosa to Durango, Colorado. So they once again turned to the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania for such a locomotive. Baldwin's answer to the Denver and Rio Grande was the 1026E, a larger 280 design featuring 36-inch diameter driving wheels. The D&RG took delivery of 12 of these locomotives from Baldwin in 1881. The railroad designated these locomotives the Class 70 because they weighed roughly 70,000 pounds, or 35 US tons. Sporting the road numbers of 400 to 411, they had slightly larger boilers and cylinder castings than their older cousins. For the first chapter of their lives, these 280s were used on road engine and helper duty on the narrow gauge mainline from Salida to Gunnison, Colorado via Marshall Pass. With the re-gauging of the Utah lines and the Tennessee Pass mainline from 3 feet to standard gauge, that is 4 feet 8.5 inches, in the 1880s and 90s, 5 of the Class 70 locomotives were re-gauged to standard gauge in 1888 and 1889, renumbered and redesignated Class 74s, only to be re-gauged to 3-foot narrow gauge again in 1900 with new 400 series road numbers, but retaining the designation of Class 74. In the early 20th century, the 70s and 74s were fitted with new Westinghouse air brakes and automatic couplers. In 1914, these locomotives were rebuilt to fit new boiler regulations. Their old boilers and diamond stacks were replaced with new steel boilers and extended smoke boxes, early electric headlights, and straight shotgun smokestacks. 2 years later, locomotives 409 and 402, as well as number 420, were sold off to the nearby Rio Grande Southern Railroad, who renumbered them to 40, 41, and 42 respectively. In 1921, the Denver and Rio Grande merged with the Rio Grande Western, reorganizing into the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, better known as the Rio Grande. 3 years later, the remaining 70s and 74s were given the new designation of C-19 and renumbered in the 340 series. The Rio Grande Southern also applied this redesignation to 40 and 41, and the designation of C-17 to number 42. Denver and Rio Grande Western number 340 was originally Denver and Rio Grande number 400 and named Green River. It was one of the 7 members that wasn't re-gauged in the late 1880s. It remained in service for whatever assignment was given to it on the narrow gauge in Colorado and New Mexico. With the arrival of the larger outside frame K-28, K-36, and K-37 Mikados from 1923 to 28 and 30, the 340 and the other C-19s were used less and less on the main lines and increasingly demoted to lesser assignments as branch line power and yard switchers. With the downturn in business on the narrow gauge in the 1930s because of the Great Depression, several C-19s were sidelined or leased to the Colorado and Southern Railway. By April of 1941, only 3 Denver and Rio Grande Western C-19s were left in existence. Those locomotives in question were 340, 345, and 346. 346 was sold off on May 19, 1947, and eventually ended up in the ownership of the Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden, Colorado. The Rio Grande's narrow gauge system began to nosedive after World War II, thanks to the rise of trucking coupled with the downshift in business when the conflict ended, on top of outdated regulation from the Interstate Commerce Commission. By the 1950s, the narrow gauge was becoming increasingly unprofitable, and so, narrow gauge lines were starting to be abandoned and pulled up one after another, and older steam locomotives were being decommissioned and sent for scrap with them. The 345 was intentionally wrecked for a head-on collision staged for a stunt in the 1952 Western movie Denver and Rio Grande. The consolidation was provided for the stunt since it was already slated to be scrapped, and it was scrapped when filming wrapped up. In the early 1950s, 340, along with Rio Grande Southern number 41, were purchased by Walter Knott to serve as centerpieces for the narrow-gauge Ghost Town and Calico Railroad located within his 57-acre amusement park, Knott's Berry Farm, located in Buena Park, California. By 1952, the Ghost Town and Calico Railroad had opened, and the two C-19s had arrived there to live out their retirement, permanently spared from facing the scrapman's torch. The two locomotives sported various appearances and paint jobs at Knott's Berry Farm, and made to look like 19th century locomotives. To look more historically authentic, the C-19s and the rolling stock they pulled were eventually reverted to their 1940s appearance. At some point following their arrival on the property, 340 and 41, though built as coal-burning locomotives, were modified to burn oil as a viable fuel source, and this one modification to both has remained unchanged since then. New California emission regulations eventually banned the use of coal-fired steam locomotives just before the turn of the 21st century. In January of 2024, the 340 had to be taken out of service for a major overhaul. KBF contracted the job to the Durango and Silverton narrow gauge railroad at their roundhouse in Durango, Colorado. The railroad has the resources to service and rebuild any 3-foot narrow gauge steam locomotives, as well as make everything entirely in-house. They do it so well to keep their steam locomotives in top mechanical shape with such high reliability that they also perform contract work to restore other people's 3-foot narrow gauge steam locomotives. Much like how the Strasburg Railroad does the same thing for standard gauge steam locomotives. The Durango and Silverton owns and operates the remains of the Rio Grande's 45.2-mile-long Silverton branch, which has been isolated from the American rail network ever since the San Juan extension from Alamosa to Durango was abandoned in 1968. The Durango to Chama, New Mexico section was ripped up from 1970 to 71, while the Antonito to Chama section became the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad in 1970, and the Alamosa to Antonito section became solely a standard gauge line, now owned and operated by the Colorado Pacific Rio Grande Railroad. The Durango and Silverton had previously performed contract work for Knott's Berry Farm when they refurbished number 41 and returned it to service by late 2023. In 2024, 340 was trucked over to the Durango Roundhouse, making it the first time the locomotive had set foot on home territory in over 70 years. By late May of 2026, the restoration of 340 was completed, and the C-19 underwent several test runs in the Durango area. These test runs were the first movements that 340 ever made on home rails in around 75 years. And on the weekend of June 5th to 7th of 2026, the locomotive made public excursions from Durango to Cascade Canyon on the Durango and Silverton. The round trip on Friday, June 5th was the first scheduled run that 340 ever made on home rails since the early 1950s. It was also on June 5th that I had the privilege of witnessing 340 in person. I wasn't scheduled to work that day, but was scheduled to work on the 6th and 7th. On June 5th, I followed the locomotive from Durango to Rockwood. Unable to access any point of the railroad north of Rockwood, I sat around there to wait for the 340 to return there. Due to track work happening at the high school in the Durango area, the 340 suffered numerous delays. But after 3 p.m., the locomotive was finally allowed to continue from Rockwood south back to Durango, now 3 hours behind schedule. From Rockwood, I followed the 340 all the way to the intersection between 15th Street and 2nd Avenue in downtown Durango. After that shot, I decided that I was done for the chase. It had been an exhausting and long day of rail fanning in the dry summer heat of southwestern Colorado. Before I called it a day, I went back up north to watch the first scheduled train head back into town. On that day, this train was pulled by number 482, one of the Durango and Silverton's former Denver and Rio Grande Western K36 Mikados. 9 out of 10 examples of this class survive today. 4 of them now reside here at the Durango and Silverton Narrow Gauge Railroad, and the other 5 at the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad. 485, meanwhile, toppled into the turntable pit at Salida, Colorado on December 6 of 1953. The locomotive was so badly destroyed that it was scrapped over a year later, making it the only K36 to suffer such a fate. In total, 3 C-19s as well as a C-17 survive today. In addition to 340 and 41 at the Ghost Town Calico Railroad, 346 is owned by the Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden, Colorado. It is currently undergoing an overhaul in the Durango and Silverton's roundhouse, but will be returned to Golden once it is finished. Another Rio Grande consolidation, C-16 number 223, will also be overhauled in Durango. Just like Rio Grande Southern 41 before it, 340 was loaded onto a truck the following day and soon taken out of Durango and back home to Knott's Berry Farm. Rocket City Railfan videos are brought to you entirely out of my own human effort without the usage of artificial intelligence. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more videos like this made out of entirely human effort, drop a like on the video and subscribe. It's free and will greatly help the algorithm show more videos like this that are entirely made out of human effort, in a time where YouTube is allowing AI-generated garbage to be unfairly pushed into the spotlight instead of much higher quality, fully human content. I'm the Rocket City Railfan. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again on the High Iron.